role of media. Are the Taliban coming calling when the US departs Afghanistan? The deep state of Pakistan and its policy of allowing extremist ideologies to flourish are actual issues of concern. At the same time, the existence of deep state.
We have on our panel
Dr. Carol Kristen Fair. She is an associate professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University. She specializes in political and military affairs in South Asia and is focused on counterterrorism. She has served as a political officer with the UN Assistance Mission to Afghanistan and as a senior research associate with the United States Institute of Peace. She specializes in political and military affairs in South Asia. She has served as a senior fellow at West Point Combating Terrorism Center and a senior resident fellow at the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi. Fair has also authored and co-edited several books. Her current book project is Lashkar-e-Toiba in its own words.
Our other panelist is K.C. Singh, IFS. After a distinguished service, K.C. Singh retired as secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs. Besides serving in different capacities in Indian posts and missions in Cairo, New York, and Ankara, he serves as Deputy Secretary to the President of India. He was ambassador to the United Arab Emirates and subsequently to Iran. He later served as Additional Secretary, International Organizations, as well as the Coordinator for Counterterrorism.
Moderating this panel is Mr. Shekhar Gupta. Shekhar Gupta is the founder and the current editor-in-chief of The Print. He is also a columnist for the Business Standard. He has had long stints at the Indian Express and India Today. Mr. Gupta writes a weekly column called The National Interest for India Today magazine, which were collected in a book in 2014 called Anticipating India. He's also hosted an interview-based television show, Walk the Talk, on NDTV 24/7. He was awarded the Padma Bhushan in 2009 by the Government of India for his contribution to journalism and was elected President of the Editors Guild of India in 2018. Over to you, sir.
Hello. Hello. Hi, Dr. Fair, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Very nice to see you.
Right. I've been asked to turn this into a chat between us because I think Shekhar Gupta has not been able to come on the program. He's got some other engagement.
No.
That's just as well. So what I would do is, in fact, I'm sitting in Dubai at the moment. So both of us are probably outside the country at the moment talking about what's happening in the region.
I have to tell you, I'm not a morning person.
So let me break it up very quickly into the way one sees it and then bring in the two elements of deep state as well as the media or social media handling it. Now, first, of course, is the transition in the US. President Trump has a little over 3 weeks left and he is hell-bent on delivering on what he had promised and therefore even cutting the troops down maybe below the 6,000 to maybe 3,500. Now, which is what the Taliban have been wanting all along while they drag their feet. And just in the neighborhood of Emirates, they've been talking, the intra-Afghan talks have been there, moving at a snail's pace. And in the meanwhile, ceasefire has not been obtained in Afghanistan, which is what the government wanted. At the same time, they say some kind of understanding is there, but we are told also there is no understanding when you talk to the government in Kabul. So which means Taliban are also probably waiting it out to see where it goes, what the Biden change involves. One common factor between Biden and Trump is that Biden in any case was against Obama's sending of extra troops to Afghanistan. So he was therefore an outlier in that. And therefore he agrees that the American troops don't need to be in Afghanistan and their role needs to be diminished. Now the question is only how you do it without leaving Afghanistan and the government there completely helpless and destabilized. The two additional factors are the popular democratic movement in Pakistan at the moment, where Imran Khan government is on the back foot. You've got Nawaz Sharif sitting offshore. You've got the Zardaris in Pakistan. So you don't know who's playing footsie with whom. But in any case, one thing is very clear, that Imran Khan is now receiving what he had given to Nawaz Sharif, which was undermining through popular protests, the legitimacy and the strength of the government. And finally, there is Iran. Now, it's extremely important to also discuss Iran, because this time, when you talk of Taliban, I've absolutely, as a former ambassador to Iran, I've absolutely no reason to disbelieve that the Taliban and the Iranians are in contact, and therefore Taliban would also keep their options open, and therefore the dependence on ISI would diminish as Taliban gets a share of power in Kabul. And they would also like to hedge their bets by making sure that they have two different avenues of access to the ocean and to the outside world, which means ISI, which they can't give up. But at the same time, they would like to use the Iranians for hedging. Now, Iran itself, again, is waiting for Biden. And we've seen what the Israelis have done. Last-minute attempts have been made to provoke them, the killing of their top nuclear scientists. And probably the hope was that the Iranians may react rashly, and therefore Trump may be able to take military action before he hands power. But the Iranians have so far lumped it, and they are waiting for Biden to come in. Now, where does Iran fit into it? Because India has always required Iran for any kind of access to Afghanistan or any kind of role in Afghanistan to balance the Pakistani interference when and if it does take place. So these are essentially the 4 or 5 components, many of which all dependent on which way the Biden policy goes. And then, of course, the Indians or the deep state in Pakistan, which, as I said, is distracted. So let's break it up. I leave it to you in which order you want to take it up, Dr. Fair. Please go ahead.
Wow. So I want to dispense with the Pakistan issue very quickly. Like you, right? I mean, at this point, I've spent 30 years almost, studying Pakistan. Got the gray hairs, the PTSD, which I mean quite literally. So we constantly hear this. Like this is like a carousel of, the leadership it's on its back feet. And I think part of the confusion about where Pakistan is stems from what I think is what's really become a casual use of the expression deep state. People like to use it. I'm not really sure what it means when we talk about a deep state in democracies like the United States and India. But when we, I think when we talk about Pakistan, it's really clear, right? Because there is no civilian control over the military. The military, there is no such thing as a rogue ISI. I think that's another myth that needs to be dispensed with. And the reason is, of course, is that the DGISI goes back to the army. And so there are consequences for him. It's always been a him, not being a sexist, if there is a major divergence. And we did see a divergence with General Mahmoud when Musharraf dispatched him to negotiate with the Taliban, and he did so in bad faith. And he was given the promotion that one gets when you're in trouble, and that was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, right? So in Pakistan, that's actually a demotion because you don't have access to troops, which was exactly why he was put in that position. So because this is an organization that's run by and for the army, I also dismiss these notions of a rogue ISI. So these dramas that happen with the civilians are always a distraction from the continuity of the Pakistan army and its intelligence agencies. I don't see anything that suggests discontinuity in what it's doing. Now, the issue, of course, as you noted, is that this is not the Taliban that we first encountered in the late 1990s, right? This is a very different organization. I would say its dependence upon Pakistan has diminished somewhat, but Iran is never going to truly provide the role that Pakistan provided for the simple reason that all of the religious and political infrastructure that gave rise to the Taliban, the Deobandi infrastructure, is in Pakistan. And now I'm aware that Deoband actually ironically begins in India, but the Deobandis in India are pro-state, they're anti-violent, right? So it's too bad that India didn't export its version of Deobandism to Afghanistan more aggressively to compete with the Pakistani version. But Iran is never going to do that. And of course, the other problem is there's a lot of organizations within that Deobandi network that can really throw a wrench in the relationship with Iran, because they're the ones that are militantly anti-Shia, right? They're the ones that are killing Shia. They are the ones, my Lashkar-e-Jhangvi has this largely incoherent minimum opus called Shia Kyon Wajibul Couple. So there's lots of opportunities that can really go wrong. And Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, which is also Sepe-Sabe, Pakistan, they've always been a supporter of the Taliban. So I don't see Iran ever being able to displace the Pakistanis, which means that the Pakistanis have largely won this war, right? And I've been saying this for decades, that the United States, there was, this outcome was foreshadowed when the United States relied so heavily upon Pakistan. It was never going to have an outcome that could be any different. And this goes to the point that you made about Biden. I think Biden, so it's easy for the vice president to have a different opinion from the president because he's not the one bearing the brunt of the policy outcome. And what I saw, and I was, and I actually had the privilege of testifying against this policy before the U.S. Congress. And I can go back and read that testimony. And I hate to say it, everything that I said exactly was as I said it was going to be. General McChrystal, he leaked this interim commander's report to the press. And it's a classic. Now this, is this deep state? I don't think so. This is just operators. What they do is they convene these working groups with these various people like Andrew Exum, people that are constantly out there in the media. This is the role of the media. And they would rather have the people pissing from within the tent rather than on the tent, right? And by making them a part of the interim commander's appreciation of the battle space, they become salesmen of the same, right? So it was a very concerted effort. He leaked it to the Washington Post. He leaked it to Congress. And then he sent his attractive young analysts to dominate the media with the brilliance of this. There was nothing brilliant about it. It was straightforwardly tying the hands of a new president to engage in a policy that everyone knew was flawed. And the reason why that surge was flawed was that we needed the surge because of Pakistan. But yet the surge also made us more dependent upon Pakistan because there were not these alternative ground lines of communication, right? So the surge basically gave Pakistan an even stronger hand. And so going to your larger question, in my view, the troops are not the issue, right? When we had 340,000 troops in the country, we could not do anything that's different from what we are seeing. And there were a lot of negative externalities to having ground troops present, right, as is well known. I mean, it's not as if, we fought a 20-year war depending upon the service in 6-month increments, right? Given the constant rotation, there was never an ability to accumulate knowledge about a particular place. By the time soldiers figured stuff out, they were rotating out. And leave aside that every service and reserve versus full-time components had different deployment policies, right? So there was never a genuine strategy in the way that Americans like to lie to themselves and say that we had, because we didn't have it. I think what the real issue is air power, right? So I think that's the real issue, is what the Afghans need is air power. And provided that Biden is more savvy, and by the way, I think Iraq is more savvy than President Trump, and you could conceivably provide that air support outside of Afghanistan. But having said this, the troop drawdown was always going to happen. Biden was never enthusiastic about troops, so this is not necessarily the issue. The problem is is that we are handing Afghanistan back to the Pakistanis. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about this. We have made no serious effort whatsoever to say to the Pakistanis, if you continue doing this, that, or the other. I mean, how many times does this need to be said, right? I mean, we saw, for example, what the UN Security Council decided, the Sanctions Committee decided to do 2 weeks ago, right, with Lukhvi's pension funds. I mean, so there's been no serious effort to curtail Pakistan, and that's my biggest concern. Now,
may I just come in here, Dr. Fair?
Yeah.
So, looking forward, you are saying the troop drawdown is inevitable. They'll go ahead with it, though Trump may accelerate it and therefore leave a more muddied state of affairs, having affected the air operations before he hands over to the president. So that president is then seen as, even if he has to send a few more flyers in, or as you said, it will probably be done out of the Gulf or out of Diego Garcia or wherever, off a ship, but you'll still have to overfly Pakistan. You would need permission. So you become dependent on them.
No, well, okay, so a couple of things about that, right? We have always been dependent upon Pakistani ALOCs, right? Even at the height. So here's what I think is really fascinating. Even at the height when the two countries should have been as close to war as possible, right? In 2011, when all kinds of crazy stuff happened. And in 2011, I was there for almost all of these things. Really bad timing on my part, or good timing. There was the Raymond Davis affair, right? Which was a big deal because he was going after Lashkar-e-Taiba. I have to say I was probably on the side of Raymond Davis. It was ISI proxies that attacked him. He's a CIA proxy. I mean, the way the Pakistanis played that, again, masterful. They're very masterful at the drama. Then, of course, there was the Osama bin Laden affair, right? And we gave the chance to the Pakistanis to be on the victory bus, right? To pretend at least that they were a part of it. And they said, no, this is a trampling of our sovereignty. How dare you kill this terrorist on our territory? And then, of course, there was the Salhalla affair, which was essentially American troops killing Pakistanis because they were just sick and tired of Pakistanis killing them, right? So when you actually talk to troops that have served in Pakistan, they know that it's not always these Taliban that are shooting at them. I mean, when I was in Kunar, you talk to our troops in Kunar, they know who's shooting at them. And it's not just the Taliban. I mean, they've talked about regular Pakistani troops. They've talked about SSG, right? So, but going just back to the general issue, in my view, the most important thing is money. And no one talks about the money. Everyone talks about the troops because in some sense, it's easy to send troops here and there, right? We use them essentially as political currency. Like, we're going to send some troops. We're going to take troops back. But the real issue is money, right? So as you know, the Soviets built a rentier state, but this is a rentier state of a size that's never previously existed, right? It can't even pay it can't pay the slightest fraction of the cost of running this state. And this is solely the fault of the Americans.
You're absolutely right. May I just interrupt, to contextualize it, that as long as the Soviet Union was intact and able to finance the Afghan government, they held on.
That's right.
The minute the Soviet Union collapsed and that support was not available,
right,
that's when the government really collapsed.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Which means coming back, do you think the Biden administration realizes this? It may take the troops back, but would get countries together, and I'm sure India would be willing to work with the US on this, on how to provide the financing. But the problem which arises is the counter move starts off that this is all money going into the pockets of the government. It's not reaching the right people, but essentially not be for developmental reasons. I think we don't need to have a pretense. We'll have to simply finance. Like somebody said, you don't have to teach the Afghans to fight. They can do all the fighting themselves. All they need is the weaponry and the money. But then there's a question of connectivity. Because now you see, last time that we helped the Northern Alliance, we and Iran were on the same side. Why I brought Iran into the discussion is the Iranians will probably not play that ball, But surprisingly, this time, it's when I was ambassador in Abu Dhabi till 2003, I used to bump into the Taliban ambassador because only 3 countries recognizing Taliban were the Emiratis, the Saudis, and the Pakistanis. But now it's reversed, where the Emiratis and the Saudis are very upset with Pakistan. I was just reading in the newspaper this morning that they, in fact, cut visas. They're trying to squeeze Pakistan by saying, we'll affect your remittances, we'll not give you new visas, etc. And therefore, they're putting the squeeze on them. What would be the relationship of, say, the Saudis with the Taliban? Of course, the Taliban have gone more towards Doha and Qatar. And so part of the problem is that that division is also working to Taliban's advantage, a division that President Trump exacerbated by backing a part of the GCC. So these fractures are actually working to Taliban's advantage and to India's disadvantage, because we have seen a foreign minister, external affairs minister, just visited only 2 countries. He just went to Doha, he just went to Bahrain and to Emirates. So the signal you're sending is that you're very much still in the Trump corner. And therefore, it would be read differently in Tehran. Now, if we want to work with Tehran, firstly, of course, US has to work with Tehran to open an alternative supply route. But that would take a long time, because for JSPO, the agreement to come back, the Iranians would want the old agreement back. Nobody can get the old agreement back, etc. And the Iranians have a presidential election coming up. They may throw up a military leader and a more right-wing president. So you'll not have Rouhani there. So things are quite complicated the way Trump is leaving them, which of course gives the Taliban space. And I would introduce one element later, which is the Islamic State of Khorasan. What is their role? Are they working with the Taliban, or they're their rivals?
So, yeah, I want to go back. So I think you've stated the regional situation. I have nothing to add to that. But I want to go back to the money, because this is actually a huge misunderstanding. Most of the money, and by the way, different countries have different execution rates. I think the Indians and the Canadians had a better job of both executing, but more importantly, keeping the money in the country. Of Ambassador Holt, and I think, as you may or may not know, the Obama administration had offered me the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia, and I declined it because I really I thought I was going to be much more effective hollering, because I just didn't agree with where the policy was going, and I didn't agree with what Holbrooke was doing. More precisely, as my mother would say, "Don't speak ill of the dead unless you're willing to do so loudly." I thought he was a disaster on AFPAC, and he was always going to be this, looming figure that would undermine things, and that's exactly what he did. But nonetheless, he was able to coerce from USAID a figure that out of every dollar the United States says it spent on Afghan reconstruction, 90 cents of that money came back to the United States in contracting fees. And I know that. I've been a contractor. I've seen the contractor proliferation. So when various people around town, including myself, have tried to figure out what's the actual amount of money that it would take to keep Afghanistan afloat, we don't know the real number, because so much of that money has come back here. And you spoke about weaponry. Again, the United States was adamant about putting Afghanistan on U.S. weaponry. The reasons for that were domestic politics. But these weapons are not weapons that are terribly suitable for the Afghans, right? And it also means that we've precluded other partnerships from basically resupplying and sustaining the Afghan arsenal. So this would have been a very natural place for Indo-US cooperation, right? So I focus my attention these days on the money for the reasons that you noted. And this is a government that's far larger than what the Soviets left in place. And so for all the reasons that you noted, Afghanistan is primed for civil war. If we don't see a civil war breaking out between various factions within the next 2 to 3 years, it will only be because of the ineptitude of the intra-Afghan negotiations, right? Because the US Taliban negotiations were essentially handing Afghanistan with a ribbon back to the Pakistanis.
True.
And the issue with the Islamic State, so I'm a skeptic of the Islamic State. It is not, there's no evidence that they were ever hanging out with Baghdadi, right? This is an entity. It's kind of like when you go to Karachi and you see KFC, it's not Kentucky Fried Chicken, it's Karachi Fried Chicken or Kabul Fried Chicken, right? This is not an authorized franchise.
Yeah.
But, and it's always, to my knowledge, been very limited to places like Kunar, Nangarhar. And also, they tend to be those elements of the Taliban that were most disaffected. So these are basically, you know, the pissed off Taliban commanders that swapped out their squiggle flag. But that doesn't mean that they're not dangerous. And this raises another interesting question about the ISI, right? So say what you will about your neighbor. It is a deviously clever state, right? It is always, like, whether you look at how it managed Harkat al-Jihad or Harkat al-Mujahideen or Jaish-e-Mohammed, when it comes to these Deobandi groups, right, which is really the most volatile, Pakistan is like a maestro. So I firmly believe that the ISI is partly behind what is calling itself the Islamic State, because Pakistan is always one step ahead in terms of what's the next Islamist proxy that the Pakistanis can deploy. And it also is a group that has a lot of implications for Pakistan's domestic security situation, because it's no secret that the parts of the Pakistan Taliban that joined the Islamic State were precisely those elements that came from this deeply sectarian background, which causes so much bloodshed in Pakistan. And they're not strictly speaking a desired proxy, right? Sometimes they do things that behoove the Pakistani state, but they're not enjoying this sanctuary. So
a related question comes up is, where is TT Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan? Where are those elements which are attacking the Pakistani military, which Pakistan always said India was fueling and funding and so on and so forth? We were supposed to have 40 consulates at one stage, 30, 20. Then they work their way towards reality. We said we have 3 or 4. We don't have 40.
Right.
So is there such a thing remaining, which is over which ISI has no control, which is targeting Pakistan?
All right. So this is sort of the genius of the Pakistani state. I mean, I hate it, but I also have to admire it. So going back to this really began in earnest, believe it or not, in 2009. So if you were watching Pakistani press, the Pakistanis, the story really begins right in late 2001 when Jaish-e-Mohammed splits effectively. The vast majority of the organization turns against the state. Masood Azhar, and they disagreed because Musharraf was helping to overturn the only emirate of Sharia based upon Deobandism, right? And that was the Taliban.
This is after the Lal Masjid attack, and
No. This is after 9/11. This is in 2000.
Okay.
Yeah. So this goes. So this story, your question has its origins in late 2001. So Masood Azhar, in fact, they took over his own madrasa in Karachi. Like, the dude lost everything. He basically was sent packing. All he had was the name of his organization. Right? That's all he had. And it was essentially him. So, I remember India, the United States, everyone just kept complaining, Masood Azhar, he's out wandering around freely, which he was in Bawalpur. But that was a good thing from the Pakistani point of view, because he went to the ISI and he said, look, I've lost control of my organization. They are turning against you. They were operating under the name of Jamaat al-Furqan and various other Jamaats. So they put him in Bawalpur and they began reinvesting in him. They began helping him rebuild his organization. So by the time you get to 2014, and that time was really important because that was the Afghan election, and the Pakistani state was deep, and actually this begins in 2013, the Pakistani state began saying, and in fact, I so I hate to say this, but I had actually predicted a serious Jaish-e-Mohammed attack long before it actually happened, because I saw what the Pakistanis were doing. So in 2013, they kept saying, we're coming into Waziristan, with Operation Zarbul Bakwas. I mean, they gave them warning for months, but they gave them two options. Your options are wayward mujahideen, go back to Afghanistan, right, and do what you were always meant to do, or rejoin Jaish-e-Mohammed. And so Jaish-e-Mohammed became this Garvapasi program for wayward Pakistani Talibs. And so that was very effective. And so when they then went into Waziristan, all they had were people who were absolutely resolved to not be Garvapasied. So the recuperation of Jaish and the reorientation to Afghanistan, in some sense, hollowed out much of the Pakistani Taliban. And so what was left were those parts of the Pakistani Taliban which went to join the Islamic State, as we know. And then at the same time, Lashkar-e-Taiba became very important domestically because they were actually countering the Islamic State. And they remain in very strict opposition to the Islamic State. So the irony is with Lashkar-e-Taiba, they are ferocious murderers, as you know, outside of Pakistan. But within Pakistan, they are non-violent. They actually, not even the Ahmadis, they don't condone any killing within Pakistan. So this is part of, as I said, if the Pakistanis applied their genius to something useful, but they are masterful at it.
As the Indian phrase goes, you don't spit in the thali you eat in.
No.
You keep that thali clean.
We have a similar expression. You don't do pashab in your own bathtub.
Yeah. Where do we go from here? Because one thing which is left out is Al-Qaeda, because part of the Afghan-US deal was that they'll have nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. And yet there is evidence that Al-Qaeda hasn't gone anywhere. Some may have died. They're saying Zawahiri's died. We don't know. Whether he has or he hasn't, because Osama died half a dozen times before he was actually killed. So in their case, as you said, it's a magic show in which all kinds of things happen. But it can't be that ISI controls it fully, because there would be elements. And I think that's where then the game comes in. I don't think India wants to get into it and worsen a civil war. And that is the difference this time, that this time Iran will not play that game. Taliban may not play the full game with Iran, but nor will Iran, because you see, Iran played that game because at that point, the US troops in Afghanistan were a threat to them. And therefore, they were willing to work with whoever was the enemy of the US. Now their primary game is all in the West. They want to defend their Shia crescent. Therefore, for Iran also, they want to play a holding game on the Afghanistan side. So they'll cut a deal with the Taliban and they would help them to the extent they can. And all they want is don't kill the Shias in Afghanistan, which probably Taliban don't want to do it anyway at this stage for their international image. So it's a lot more complicated. History is repeating itself, but with many more complications, with Russia and China drawn closer, with the Chinese sitting on our frontiers in Ladakh, and therefore closing many of the Indian military options, because then Pakistan gets a free hand instead of worrying that if they do too much on their Western front, the Indians will put pressure on them on their Eastern front. So where do you see now the Taliban going from here? You think they will abandon the intra-Afghan talks and ratchet up the killings, or they will just keep doing what they're doing at the moment, which is creeping control?
So to go back to your original question about Al-Qaeda, let's be really clear. The Taliban have done nothing that the United States requested. Nothing. The killing has continued. And in fact, Trump, I can't even use the word president in Trump without a healthy pause between the words. It's frustrating. Pompeo, as you know, told President Ghani that if you don't let those 5,000 Taliban prisoners go, we are going to stop. We're going to cut your aid, right? So, hello, of course, I mean, Ghani knows, no matter what he says, he knows he's dependent upon U.S. aid. But that's the kind of shenanigans that the Trump administration did. And those 5,000, not only was there no requirement that they not stop, that they not kill again, they have been killing again. So to your question, the Taliban, what they're actually doing is working. It's working for them, right? They're continuing to kill. They're still getting their way with the U.S. withdrawal. The Americans have really been shameless in their delegitimizing the nature of Afghan democracy, which I think is incredibly rich. Barnett Rubin, I mean, he's like a windsock. You know, he was part of building this very constitution, this very political system, the single non-transferable vote that was always designed to produce politicians with a very limited base, right? You can win an election with just a couple of hundred votes because of the number of candidates, the illegality and illegitimacy of political parties. These are the things that the Americans wanted, because Karzai wanted, and we could have a puppet president, and all of the things that the Americans built. They are now saying, well, you know, Afghan democracy hasn't really fructified, and they're pushing Ghani to give up an election that, while the turnout may have been very low, those people put their lives on the risk to vote for this man. And it has been appalling to see U.S. officials argue that he should give way to the Taliban, who refuse to contest elections. I could not be more angry with my U.S. government, except I know I can be. So the Taliban have exactly what they want. The Americans are leaving. They have delegitimized Ghani so much. And the Pakistanis have been very clever too here as well. Like the Pakistani feting of Abdullah is not because they like Abdullah, right? It's because they see the delegitimization of Afghan democracy as a way station to their destination, which is really, for the most part, having a chaos in Afghanistan. So going to your point, Pakistan does not exert positive control over the Taliban. It cannot say, we want you to do X. It can punish them in other words, it can exert negative control, right? But what Pakistan has always preferred, and you know it better than anyone else, is that because Pakistan is a maestro of chaos, Afghanistan, under situations of chaos, is far more suitable to Pakistan than an Afghanistan which is reasonably stable, because a reasonably stable Afghanistan is going to have relations with Iran and India for the reasons that you noted, right? The Afghans hate the Pakistanis, right? Hate them. You know this. So the Pakistanis would rather play this game of chaos that it did throughout the 1990s, right? So going back to Iran, I have always been a supporter of, which has often been misconstrued by some members of the Indian press. I have not been a critic of the Indo-Iran relationship. Far to the contrary. Afghanistan needs Chabahar to be developed because it needs an alternative to the economic blackmail that Pakistan is capable of with respect to Afghanistan. And for Chabahar to become a truly economically viable DC port, we got to get some version of a deal going back. Now, it's not. So I'm hoping that Biden is going to try and revivify some version of the JCPOA. But you have already stated the problems with this, both with respect to the Iranian domestic policy. Iran's going to want what it was, but it's made progress in its nuclear program thanks to President Trump withdrawing. So we're not going to be able to get back to the status quo ex ante. But I'm hoping, but just also at the very end of the Obama administration, when you could be when you could have been as optimistic as you could have been, like in that last year or so of the Obama administration, the international community was still wary of investing in Chabahar because the legal status of those investments weren't clear. So my fear is that the Afghan government has been not only destabilized, but delegitimized. Like democracy has just been delegitimized. The Pakistanis are getting the chaos that they want. Iran is getting what it wants by being able to have this, side hustle with the Taliban. And the amount of time that it's going to take to try to recuperate the U.S.-Iran relationship, that's going to happen on a time frame which is much longer, right, than the degradation of Afghanistan.
Correct. So some of the things, so I think, as I see it, the conversation that the Indian government would or should be having with the Biden administration, much as their primary focus will be on domestic, on NATO, on rebuilding alliances. Despite that, I think India needs to work with the US and have them focus on this and say at least remove some of the sanctions which are not related to the nuclear thing, which are not related to, say, terrorism and so on and so forth, which should include at least some of the banking ones so that a port can start functioning, because the port cannot function if there's no trade, there's no free trade. Ports can only function when you can trade through them, and there are no sanctions involved. So that is something, it'll take a long time. And the danger is the kind of deals, of course, with Iran. There's always a good chance that when they come to an agreement with China for a 10-year, multi-billion-dollar deal, it's not going to work because the Iranians will have small print, which will drive the Chinese crazy. And much of it they may be doing to threaten the West, threaten the Americans, that I will do this. It's like a child going to the second floor and saying, you don't give me more pocket money, I'll jump from the second floor. So the Iranians do all this. But nevertheless, the Chinese footprint has grown. And if they start developing that additional port, which is between Chabahar and Gwadar, and they get greater control on that port outside the Straits of Hormuz, you're giving Chinese tremendous control on the North Arabian Sea, because they have it in Gwadar, they have it in a new port. And in any case, the Iranians have been saying that Chabahar is not exclusive to any country, and all countries are welcome. And the Chinese are, with the deep pockets, already there, and they're there in the Iranian economy. So to roll much of that back, you're absolutely correct. There is, it won't be, there'll be a time lapse between what US does with Iran and rolls things back, what China would do, and what Taliban will end up doing in Afghanistan. And I think, how do you bridge that gap? I think that's the issue.
I don't think anyone can. I'm a realistic person. I've always been a pessimist, but being a pessimist has always been the right hand to play. So I don't see a way of doing this. I think that we are. And again, President Trump has exacerbated a bad situation. But the foundations of this catastrophe were laid by George W. Bush, right, in his founding relationship with Pakistan and Afghanistan. Obama continued it for 8 years, right? And unlike George W. Bush, Obama understood the Pakistan problem. Like George W. Bush saw inside Musharraf's soul, whatever, just like he did Putin. Obama understood, right? So in some ways, I hold Obama more responsible because he did not exhibit leadership in standing up to his generals and saying, this might be what you want to do, but this is not what's good for the country, and it's not good for Afghanistan, right? So, it's hard for me to say this, but in this respect, Trump inherited many good things from Obama that he lied about, like an economy, but he did not inherit a good hand in Afghanistan from Obama. So any expectations that Biden is going to magically come down here and figure this crap out when the previous 19 years of leadership couldn't, I think is going to be a problem. So but I think this larger question, and let's be really clear, we are in a domestic shitstorm, right? The first thing that Biden has to do is stop having Americans die from COVID, right? So, people keep asking, well, what's Biden's Asia strategy? And I'm like, well, why don't you let him figure out how to stop Americans from needlessly dying, right? I mean, we are losing more at this point, more than a 9/11 a day, right? It's insane. So I don't expect this administration to get its act together very soon. And it also depends on what happens in the Senate, right? Because the Senate, if the Senate is controlled by Republicans, this is going to be a huge thwarting apparatus to whatever Biden wants to do, right? So we're not even going to know that until mid-January. So the bigger issues you said is China. China has really taken a role in recent years that's been different from because in its historical role, it was never as supportive of Pakistan as people have said. It's never provided military support. During Kargil, it told the Pakistanis to get out. It took India's position. But Pakistan now has a much more aggressive supporter in China. And so if I were Indian leadership, I would not anticipate a global coalition against China, because I'm amazed at how many people are panda huggers. I'm a China hawk. This is the most significant threat to the liberal world order, in which India is a key component than anything else. But if you look at all the different countries that are involved, we are all so dependent upon that shitty Chinese economy of producing inexpensive, dangerous things, that we can't be hawkish against China when all of our IT equipment comes from China, right? So I don't know who is going to lead a global coalition against the biggest threat to the liberal world order when we are all dependent upon that very threat, right? It's genociding Uyghurs. And what has the world said or done?
So where Taliban is concerned, in the past, they had outsourced it to Pakistan, and they felt that their Xinjiang Uyghur problem will be taken care of. And that is the price all the jihadi tanzeems paid for not paying attention there, because China was the big brother. And that will probably continue. But now to just shift gears a little, we have not discussed the role of media, social media, in all this. Where is the Pakistani media going? Is it completely on board with the military? In India also we're seeing it's got overly hyper-national. It gets easily taken on when the government takes a hyper-nationalist stand. They're ready to go to war with anyone, to the extent they're ready to go and go after Trudeau simply because he said farmers should be allowed to demonstrate. So this sort of thing is happening all over, and therefore it becomes easier or it becomes even more difficult to handle situations, because any attack on India, now you fed this thing that you want instant retribution. And that is where questions were asked, that when it comes to China, we are very considerate. We are saying, no, we'll take our own time. When it comes to somebody else, hey, why don't we go and hit the guy? So what happens in Afghanistan? Because many of these groups are now, like in the past, you see, because of this seamless link between Pakistan-based groups aimed at India and the Taliban, that some of the training camps will shift, or some of the training will shift to that place. Some of the blooding of the new warriors will take place in Afghanistan, and then they'll be moved back this side.
So the media issue is very frustrating. And I think the United States, India, and Pakistan, we all have a media problem. They have some commonalities, but they also have some significant differences. So what the military has been able to do, it's been able to squeeze out any credible media. The Herald has been squished into non-existence. Frontline is also gone. In fact, it's interesting. I think this regime is far more vicious than even Zia was, because there are people who are living in exile. Like Najim Sethi is a good example. Right? Najim Sethi had his differences with just about everyone, but he's kind of like President Rouhani. He was always able to reconcile, right? I mean, he was never out in the cold forever. he is, I mean, so he has been out in the cold now for a very, very long time. And so it's the diversity of people, because usually the same people, they kind of get exiled. It's like a swapping of exiles. But now a very diverse array of people are living in exile. So the Pakistanis have really squashed any kind of independent investigative media that so many of us had relied upon. You know, for me, getting the Herald was, I always told my friends in the CIA or wherever, forget your stupid cables, read the Herald, you know, but that's gone. Now, India and the US have a very similar structural problem, which is to say, it's the private media, right? Private media is all about ratings. Unfortunately, what gives good ratings is a zoo. Our private sector has not failed to deliver on the zoo effect. I can't even watch Indian or US TV without getting a migraine, because you have banners underneath, banners on the top, flames shooting across, and like 15 people screaming at each other. I mean, and people tune in for the zoo effect. And so part of it is privatized media. It's exacerbated in India because the ties between the media and the government are just a lot stronger than they are in the United States. And the Indian Constitution has retained a lot of those repressive laws that stifle speech that the British imposed. So you can have offenses to sensibilities. You know, there's all, I just look at the different charges under which journalists are harassed. So we don't have that. I mean, our journalists, if we're actually our zookeepers can say anything that they want, and there's very little that's illegal. I mean, you've seen
with one little difference. In India, a prime minister doesn't scold journalists. He gets others to do it. In America, President Trump did all the scolding himself on a daily basis.
Yeah. So no. So his ability to do this, though, again, this goes back, I would say, to it had nothing to do with George W. It had to do with the economic restructuring of media, right? So around 2000, about the time that we were going to war with Iraq, again, another outrage that a Republican beset upon the world, the traditional print media had lost all of its money. And you saw this huge move away from investigative journalism to what we now call access journalism. So the media went from being a watchdog, right? So George W. Bush says that Iraq has ties with Osama bin Laden and nuclear weapons, right? So the traditional role would have been to investigate what we now know. We knew at the time they were lies. Instead, because it had no money, it relied upon access to the White House. And so journalists, whether it was CNN, whoever, they were simply reporting what the White House said, right? So access became very, very critical. So by the time we get to Trump, journalists don't know how to be journalists. Journalists think that sitting in a White House press briefing is journalism, right? So they become accustomed to being amanuenses. So when President Trump said, if you don't write nice things about me, I'm not going to give you access, journalism had become to the point where that was the primary currency. So that's, so Trump was able to capitalize upon this significant change that had happened in journalism, right? So one of the upsides of Trump battering journalists and, literally causing them to get death threats, right, was that when they were denied access, some actually went back to their roots and began doing investigative journalism, right? But this is and I would say, India is no different in this regard. Access is money. If you can't have access to political leadership, if you can't have that 3-second flash on one of the 15 screens of people screaming at each other. Why?
And particularly when the owners are businessmen, it becomes
Yes,
very few owner proprietors left, whose
yes,
only Hindu is there, or a few
right,
newspapers, where trusts are running them, or people,
right,
their main business is running a newspaper.
right.
So a few papers are surviving on that.
Yep.
Essentially, the other papers or television channels, the owners are businessmen or business people. But tell me something. I've never seen anything written about, say, how's Taliban using the media or social media? Is social media a factor in Taliban in Afghanistan, or it's not? Because we know that Osama bin Laden used to record his things. Some of those recordings were found when his lair was captured. So how do they communicate? Because they want to remain anonymous, or are they using social media?
Well, so for better, I mean, so I'm going to, this is outside of my wheelhouse to a significant degree. I mean, the Taliban, they still rely upon night letters, right? This has always been like their preferred communication, but they're much more media savvy, right? So this is very different from the Taliban of 1998 that eschewed media. These guys are very media savvy, and actually, because they have had really important enablers in Washington, D.C. with this Doha process, they've become normalized, right? I mean, can you imagine having the leader of a foreign terrorist organization, writing an op-ed for the New York Times? Now, you know that Siraj Haqqani did not write that. Who did write it? I have some pretty strong suspicions, right? Barney, you know who you are. So they've been normalized, right? When you have the media flocking to Doha, and I had to say, all of these fellows are very, I mean, no mahine da pet. I mean, these gentlemen are not starving. Right? They are all very well-fed fellows, right? They're not in hiding. They are living very well in Doha. There's nothing underground about them anymore, right? They are giving media interviews. They've been thoroughly mainstreamed, which I actually think is a huge problem. It's not normal, right? That mass murderers should be treated as if they are a normal piece of political machinery.
Absolutely, they're mainstream. But tell me, what about social media? Are they conscious of the role of social media? Is there social media in Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, look, they've got proxies that are active on Twitter. Afghans. So look, this is a huge generational thing, right? I mean, so this morning, Mandeep apparently they were trying to reach me on WhatsApp. I don't use WhatsApp. I'm an old lady who's friggin' blind. I can't see WhatsApp, right? So, I mean, there's clearly a generational issue. Youngsters, they use their smartphones just like Indians do. Americans are actually slow adapters. I think Asians were using their smartphones to do things more smartly than Americans were. So older folks are not using that. Now, so here's an interesting thing, though, right? So when I've seen U.S. officials deal with Afghans, they tend to deal with people our age, right? And so there might be a lot of disaffection with democracy amongst older people, right? So when you look at who do governments interact with, they tend to deal with people our age and older. But the demographic bubble are, of course, all of these youngsters who've become used to democracy and want democracy. And they've been given a promise about what their life is going to be like. So these are the people that are engaging in social media. I see them just as active, being just as active as Taliban proxies are in social media. And I spend too much time on Twitter. I do it on my computer where I can read the crap, not my phone. So I think social media is important, but I think with respect to the generation, that the US government has been engaging with, I don't think it's as relevant as the regular media, which has so mainstreamed these murderers. Does that make sense?
You think ISI has got savvy about this and are
Oh
beginning
my
to use
gosh.
it
The
in a front?
ISI, that's a whole other issue. The ISI is so flippin' savvy. So look, I am convinced, and you know, I obviously have no evidence for this, so let me make that caveat. I'm pretty convinced that the Pakistanis have a lot of people in employ at Twitter, because it's astonishing to me the relatively banal things that can get one banned from Twitter. The merest criticism of Cocaine Khan can get you banished from Twitter. And that there's nothing in Twitter's rules that should facilitate that, right? So similarly in Facebook, and you know, and I've interacted with Facebook. I know Brian Fishman because he and we go back to the Combating Terrorism Center. You know, he was there when I was doing the work with on Lashkar-e-Taiba with them. You know, the ability of all of these terrorist groups to operate on Facebook. I mean, Jamaat al-Dawa, they have a really strong Facebook presence. They don't so much use Twitter. So the ISI has spent quite a bit of time doing media management, and everyone knows there are these Karaya Pay Twitter accounts. And they have a very standard modus operandi. So they pose as kind of being critical of the military, but you know that they're not real, because if they were truly that critical, they wouldn't be sitting there twittering. And then once they cultivate rapport with key Twitter users, then they go into full disinformation mode. I've experienced this. Like, they'll cultivate me, they'll say things that I might find interesting. And then once they feel like, oh, I've got this lady eating out of my hand, I'm going to go full Abhara on her. And, you know, I'm an old lady. I've been around the block. I've seen this play out. Because before they did this in social media, they did this in the traditional media, right? Like Amir Rana is a classic example. Amir Rana, he gets this book in Urdu where he allegedly puts all this detailed information about the jihadi groups. He gets an Indian organization to translate it into English. And the next thing you know, he is like the ISI China face of peace studies in Pakistan. And if you just go to Amazon and you look at how many books he's written, you know, you just do the math. It's not possible to write that many pages in a day. And if you've ever met Amir Rana, he's functionally illiterate in English. So how is he writing all of these books? So, you know, long before social media came, Pakistan did this in traditional media, right? So it's again, superbly expert at the arts of the nefarious.
Now, in the last segment, let's do some scenario building. What do you think is going to happen next between now and November and January 20, which is when, besides the drama which will go on in US, where President Trump will still threaten to, maybe be sworn in, though it's less and less emphatic. He may have a parallel swearing in and some other theater. But in any case, what happens? What would Taliban be thinking? What would ISI be planning between now and after Biden takes over?
I mean, look, I don't know. I mean, I can't go back to Pakistan, as is well known. And so I'm not very well suited. So that, you know, the people who go to Pakistan all the time, like Michael Kugelman, he's not going to speak bluntly about this, which is why he still gets a visa. And people who do speak bluntly, we don't get visas, right? So, I'm not one of the scenario types, because that's just not my forte. I'm very happy looking at trees.
And you also said you're a pessimist.
Well, yeah, and I am a pessimist.
Realist. Let's say you're a realist.
Yeah, okay, sure. But the United States, I don't think anyone should underestimate how screwed we are, right? Because we have 40% of Americans who think Trump won the election. Like this is, and the depth of their insanity does not stop there. They genuinely believe that the Democrats are running a global pedophile ring. This is this QAnon insanity that has been, it's a conspiracy theory in the classic sense. You can't argue with it. The more you try to like, well, what's your evidence for this? Well, there is no evidence because it's so deeply covered up by the deep state. I mean, it is a self-licking ice cream cone of idiocy. And the reemergence of white supremacist groups. So just last weekend in the district, my husband and I, we went there just to sort of see what the stupidity looked like. The so-called Proud Boys, these are white supremacist militias. They didn't have their guns in DC because that's illegal. But when they're here in Virginia or elsewhere, they always have they're just festooned with weaponry. They're like a walking arsenal. And the T-shirts, if you're familiar with the white supremacist lingo, was amazing. So one of the T-shirts had a very fascist symbol derived from Nazi Germany, and it said 6 MWNE. Right? So that's code speak. It's actually an acronym for 6 million were not enough. Right? These people were marching in Washington, D.C. in large number. And when, as I said, these militias, I mean, we've had attempts upon governors' lives, right? They have marched into state capitals with their guns. They tried to preempt voting. They showed up to polling stations with those guns. And what we have seen across the board is that our institutions have been deeply corrupted. And Biden, and this is what I'm saying, Asia watchers have to chill the heck out because he has a big choice to make. Does he want to take the traditional namby-pamby Democrat way, which is, let's just be friends and let's just like move beyond this? No. If he wants to fix our situation, he needs to prosecute. We have, listen, sir, 40% of our state's attorneys general.
Yeah, correct.
40%. This is insane. How, I mean, so he's going to have massive, massive decisions. And because of the shambolic nature of the transfer of power, he's not been given the access that he needs. And there's a big fear that President Trump right now is busy destroying classified information. So if he doesn't have a plan for Pakistan and Afghanistan, I'm going to cut the guy some slack because this is insane. We have a pandemic, we have massively corrupted institutions, and we have at least 40% of Americans believing that he represents a global pedophile ring. Can you imagine anything more insane, sir?
Well, I hope it's been taken, I'm sure it's been taken note of in Delhi. And so the essential wisdom from this is that all countries, the big powers in Asia, they better have the alternative plans. You can't be waiting for Biden to ride in on a white steed and save all of us. I think we have to have alternative strategies. And many of those strategies stand stymied now. Like traditionally, we would have worked with Iran. We can't do it because we tied ourselves very closely to Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Trump. We can't work too closely with Russia because the Russians are working with the Chinese. We can't go directly to Afghanistan. And therefore, how do you really support people who are friendly to you in Kabul when they come under greater pressure and the Americans are withdrawing and the Americans are not able to pay enough attention? So, all these factors, and there's nothing, and the Europeans are equally, they're quite happy. NATO are happy to quit. They'll have about 6,000. If Americans are leaving, NATO would also walk out. So the numbers will come down in Afghanistan. Currently, the total is about 12,000. Britain is busier with Brexit than with anything else. Australians are busy fighting the Chinese. and saving their necks from them rather than send troops anywhere. And Canadians, well, we don't like Prime Minister Trudeau anyway because he thinks farmers shouldn't be marching. So, there's so many of your options, diplomatic options are cut by all kinds of belief systems in all the countries that I think Taliban must love the scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you who really loves the scenario is China. I mean, so I insist upon calling COVID the Wuhan. I insist, because this was not a natural disaster. China has known for decades. I even have a scientific paper going back to 2007 when they identified this policy of trafficking animals, keeping them in bio-insecure environments. That's what created SARS, right? China has known this. And in fact, since SARS was created by this Chinese economy of trafficked animals, it's doubled down, right? Because the wealthy Chinese have to have pangolin scales to treat their, their erectile dysfunction. And China is the only economy that's benefited from the Wuhan, right? Because all of the stuff that we need to try and keep our citizens from dying is made in China, right? I try to not buy masks made in China. I make my own masks. But then, unfortunately, I realized that the fabric is made in China. I can't even find cotton fabric made in the United States, right? So China, and I also think part of the motivation for the Punga taking that China's been doing with India and Ladakh, which again, I mean, murdering Indian soldiers with clubs wrapped in barbed wire, this behavior committed by one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, right? I think it has really taken advantage of the fact that everyone else has been put on the back foot because of the Wuhan. It's exploited this. And then also, I think there's a degree to which that China and Pakistan have been responding to Article 370, right? So the Gilgit-Baltistan making it a province has been on the many, from the time I was a student, they wanted to be a province for the reasons they didn't want to be governed by Islamabad. But if you ask why now, I think the Pakistanis know that India is really constrained, right? The Chinese have been so aggressive. And just as you noted, whenever Pakistan, farts in India's direction, but when China murders Indian soldiers with barbed wire wrapped clubs, the media is appeasing. And I would say we have the same problem here. No one is, when those of us like me criticize China, we're called racists. I'm a racist because I think China's policies are horrendous, right? And people are afraid to criticize China because China has its social media is very aggressive in labeling people racist, which I think is rich coming from a country.
Look at the 14-point demand they presented to Australia. And amongst the demand are silly things like, why did you criticize us? Why did you do this? I mean, what kind of childish demands are those? There's no geopolitics in that. Simply saying you insulted us. Yes. Even that is a demand. So, how you deal with us, how you talk to us, that's going to make us very angry. I mean, it's not even a territorial dispute. No. It's not even a dispute over issues. It's simply, no, you haven't shown respect. You were disrespectful. And so the 14 demands presented. Yeah.
You know who talks like that? A mafioso talks like that.
True. So
no, I think China is our biggest problem.
Yeah, I'll leave you to Dr. Fair, your concluding remarks. We have about 7 minutes.
Oh, I don't have any concluding remarks. I mean, this is.
I think
if people want to ask questions, maybe.
Yeah, we can leave it open if somebody wants to ask a question. Exactly. Okay, there's Mr. Amarpreet Dhat. He says, what are your views upon USA's policy on Pakistan as they are the one Well, we already discussed that. One, having major control on policies of Taliban. I think we already discussed it. If you want to add anything, please go ahead.
No, I mean, I've been a foe of our policy since the earliest days. I mean, I remember in 2004, I was the only person in Washington, D.C. saying this is madness. My views on this, first of all, it's not a policy, right? It's the failure to have a policy. The U.S. has basically treated Pakistan as something that could be rented. And the understanding is that it's like for those of you who are old enough to remember parking meters, you put a quarter in, you're expecting to get 15 minutes. And with Pakistan, you get 1 minute. But there's this tremendous reticence to have a new policy because policymakers are very risk averse. If you put a quarter in, you might get negative 15 minutes. So this idea of Pakistan being a marginal satisfier in a predictable way is preferable to a policymaker than a very disruptive policy that might be more beneficial over the long term. And so what essentially happens is that the U.S. subsidizes the worst of Pakistani behavior. But from the point of view of a policymaker who's thinking about his or her reelection in a 2-year cycle, you don't care what the long-term consequences are, right? So this is a longer discussion, but I'm obviously anyone who's sentient and thinking knows that the U.S. has not had a positive effect on Pakistani behavior.
Or able to shape it. Next question, please. Mr. Shantanu Puri, for both you and me, what do you believe is the deep state scenario in India? I think we already discussed it. Dr. Fair said it is not a deep state. It's a state with a country attached. It's the state itself. So it's the military with a state attached. Dr. Fair.
So like I said, I don't like this use of deep state being applied willy-nilly. No one ever defines it. I should maybe ask this fellow what he thinks a deep state is. Pakistan is a deep state in the sense that the military, which in a normal country would be subordinate to military institutions, runs the country. So we can say very clearly that Pakistan's a deep state. But in India, it's just the opposite problem. India is under-militarized, right? The military leadership has very little say in terms of policy. So I don't understand how people talk about the Indian deep state. I'd have to throw the question back at the asker. What do you think a deep state is? And I don't think it is what you think it is. I don't know. What do you think of this, Ambassador Singh?
In the Indian context, it's the Indian intelligence agencies which have often been used by the governments from the Congress time, not just now, for political ends. So the Intelligence Bureau spent as much time on monitoring the opposition, giving assessment of rival political parties, maybe even running funds and so on and so forth. Which without proper oversight. So that's been an unfortunate part of the role of domestic agencies and domestic politics. As far as the external research and analysis wing is concerned, again, oversight is missing. We don't have the kind of congressional oversight which US has. Many elected people have also asked for it. So there's always a feeling that there are these agencies that, and this includes investigating agencies, financial nature, enforcement directorate, which are not a deep state. They are actually more to deter and to go after people if you don't like it. Well, that happens in US also.
Yes.
US president have used the revenue service, not always successfully, but yes, even there it happened. But then US is a much more mature democracy, and despite that, we've seen the regression. Despite US having matured, having had a civil war, having had faced wars abroad, having risen to great heights, having matured to that extent, it still regressed. Would you like to add to that, Dr. Fair?
No, I think you stated it. I mean, so I think part of the problem, politicians, they're not my favorite group of folk because to be a politician requires certain skill sets that I'm not a fan of. You have to be able to artfully lie. You have to be able to mobilize money. So the people who have perhaps the best intentions will never be politicians, right? That's just a fact. So if you are a prosecutor, you pretty much have the pick of the litter on who you want to prosecute, because there'll be very few politicians anywhere, I assure you, whose lives would survive the scrutiny of a proper investigation. So the issue, of course, is that certain governments have used this fact advantageously, right? Going after members of certain parties more consistently than others, right? And there are some parties, I have to say, the Democrats there have been very conspicuous Democratic criminals, but on the majority of the most atrocious criminals have been in recent years in the Republican Party, right? So, but yeah, I really appreciated your explanation of how people think of the deep state in India. I should have figured that out, because I did my dissertation on the Khalistan insurgency, and there's a lot of so-called deep state when you define it that way. So I thank you very much for that explanation. That was incredibly insightful for me.
Okay, next question, maybe the last question, because we are approaching 5. Well, it's Mr. Puri again. What's the most important? No, this we already answered. What's the lesson the Indian deep state can learn from ISI? I hope none, but Dr. Puri, Dr. Fair, we don't. I hope they don't learn anything from them. But please go ahead.
Well, I think there is one thing to be learned.
Yeah.
So I think there's very compelling reasons for India to robustly develop subconventional deterrence, right? I think the fiasco in Balakot really could have been avoided if India had some pretty serious subconventional deterrence. There's no reason why these terrorists running around Pakistan so freely should feel so safe. And we know that this was a decision that was made by Gujarat as a confidence building measure, and it takes a really long time to build those assets. The problem for India in this regard, and I think this goes to your point, sir, about not learning lessons, is that the most tempting groups to work with are the ones that are probably the most dangerous for India, because India doesn't want to sink to the moral depravity of Pakistan, right? India wants to retain the moral high ground while also punishing Pakistan in a non-escalatory way that rises to a level where warfare could be a possible outcome. So the Baloch, for example, it's always attractive to think about supporting the Baloch, but the Baloch are very ill-disciplined and they kill civilians. So I would argue that that's a terrible group, a set of groups to work with. The best place to, and it could have, all sorts of consequences for India. But I think the best place to think about is exploiting the fact that Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Islamic State hate each other, that they're TNSM, not a big fan of Lashkar-e-Taiba. So if I were thinking about subconventional deterrence, I would be trying to find ways of getting these groups to kill each other. And that can be done through very effective influence operations and money, right? So I think that is one lesson that India should learn, is that when you have an adversary who exploits subconventional warfare under the safety of its ever-expanding, reckless nuclear umbrella, I think it's dereliction of duty to not have subconventional deterrent capabilities. I don't know, what do you think, Ambassador Singh?
No, I agree with you. I totally agree with you. I've always said that we don't have to take the other guy's route. The danger which police force very often at home when they're fighting, say, Naxalites or militants or Khalistanis or whoever, you don't want to descend to their level. Otherwise, you become kind of the same in uniform. You don't want that.
Right.
Yeah. If we have time, maybe one more question. Otherwise, that's it.
Well, sir, I have to say, I just would like to say thank you for being a part of this again. I just think this is one of the neatest literature festivals that I've ever encountered. I really enjoyed participating in Chandigarh. This is also Sarson da Saag and Makai di Roti season.
Thank you, Dr. Fair. Thank you very much.
You, sir, has also been just, this has just truly been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. That was interesting. And I like the sarson ka saag and makki ki roti in the end of it, on a lighter side. Coming to the most discussed topic today is the saber rattling in Ladakh. The standoff in Ladakh has the potential to escalate into a major conflict, both for India and China. China's expansionist policies and its cyber and multi-domain threat capability are all realities that will dominate the struggle. The Chinese moved first and upset the status quo. Is there a real chance of normalcy without leveraging global influence? Will this escalation lead to an international involvement? Will that be in India's interest? Will China's occupation